Few people have had an impact on the history of this century quite like Julian Assange, and few have been as polarising.
Good evening, London.
To some, he's a principled champion of free speech. To others, he's an irresponsible anarchist. Assange has sparked fierce debate about the power of information, over the right to know and the right to keep secrets.
Police descended on this building.
I suppose very flawed personalities often are, sort of the engineers of history, and I think Julian Assange is one.
I don't see Julian Assange as this great crusader of transparency. I see him as a reckless narcissist.
7 years of detention.
He's quixotic, charming, brilliant, intolerable, maverick, difficult, impossible, narcissistic, entrepreneurial, vindictive. I mean, we could go on all night, and he's all those things. And that's, in a way, why we're here talking about him. He's a very interesting man.
As WikiLeaks stands under threat.
Julian Assange harnessed the technology of the digital age and challenged the supremacy of governments.
He invented this mechanism by which people could be given a voice, and not just a voice, but an outlet for information by the terabyte.
In April, Assange was finally dragged from his sunless refuge in the Ecuadorian Embassy in London. He's now facing espionage charges and could spend the rest of his life in jail.
He's now in prison, facing extradition. This fight could go on for years. It's an incredibly sad story, and it's disappointing to me that more people are not outraged by the treatment that an Australian citizen who has won awards for his publishing work is now being prosecuted for having made that information public.
A line has been drawn in the sand, and either you are going to support Julian and fight this extradition and those indictments, or you basically step back and the lights will go out. That's how serious it is.
From teenage computer hacker to person of global influence, Julian Assange has become one of the most significant and divisive figures of our time. Tonight on Four Corners, we look at how he harnessed the power of the digital era, and we ask the question, is Assange a hero or a villain?
More that keep walking by, and one of them has a weapon. Roger, received, Target. Okay. 208. See all those people standing down there?
In 2010, a little-known organisation called WikiLeaks exploded onto the world stage when it released classified US military footage that revealed a shocking event during the war in Iraq.
Yep, he's got a weapon too.
In this video, you have this idea that basically something terrible is about to happen. And then it still builds up over some minutes. It's working, it's building up towards something terrible. You have this idea. And then suddenly all hell breaks loose in this video. And it just gets worse from there.
Just fucking, once you get on them, just open them up. Okay, Roger. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees right along this. You're clear. All right, firing. Line here. When the stage line, let me know when you have it. We'll shoot. Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire. Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot. Roger. Got him.
6 is a 2-6. We'll move, but we got 13.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle. All right. I hit him.
The footage showed an attack on a group of men by US Apache helicopters. 12 people, including 2 Reuters news staff, were killed. 2 children were injured. The callous behaviour of the US troops exposed the brutality of the conflict to the world.
All right, we got about 8 individuals. Yeah, we got one guy crawling around down there, but we definitely got some. Or shooting some more.
Collateral murder in 2010 was what gave us, let's say, world headlines in every major news publication anywhere in the world, which led to, people, millions of people watching this video on YouTube.
Hey, you shoot out top. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
WikiLeaks went from this obscure organization that very few people, certainly outside the sort of national security news business, had ever heard of, to being, talked about all over the world.
The Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Oh yeah, look at those dead bastards. Nice. 26, Crazy Horse 18.
That video has since, of course, become iconic as a testimony of the Iraq War. It's like the napalm girl of the Vietnam War. It tells a bigger story than the video.
And joining me now for more details on both the release and the video, Julian Assange. He's co-founder and editor of the website. Hi there, Julian.
The collateral murder video also made Julian Assange a household name. He was pursued and feted by media around the world. Everyone wanted to know who this digital disruptor was.
What does the release of this video say about the role of your website? Are you essentially now the new fourth estate, the watchdogs, so to speak?
Well, reporters that don't have new information, to some degree, have nothing useful to say. And what keeps people honest and what keeps our management over civilization going is we understand how the world actually works.
The question was, who is the source of this, and who is this guy, Julian Assange?
Suddenly this guy emerges who's a kind of hacker, developer. I mean, nobody knew quite how to categorize him or how somebody like that would have access to Defense Department. We assume that was where it had come from, material. So he seemed to sort of have dark arts that the rest of us didn't have.
Everybody wanted to meet him. Everybody, it was like having an audience with him. And not just a rock star, but it was combined with this whole secret agent type of vibe that it had to it. Everything was super secretive. Everything had to be done. The whole communication was complicated. So this was in itself also even more appealing to everybody who wanted to meet him. It was rock star combined with a James Bond type of vibe.
Daniel Domscheit-Berg was one of the early members of WikiLeaks. He put his life savings into the group.
Basically, Julian was living off my money for some time as well. I invested something around 50,000 euros or so into buying some servers, buying laptops for people who needed to work. Then we had this situation in Reykjavik where we were all, 6 people crashing in 2 rooms in a hotel for some time, So in 2009, I put all my furniture into a storage and dissolved my apartment as well. And we were just living on the road, basically. So it was people crashing on other people's couches or living in small-time hotel rooms, in order to work on this project.
This is 2-6, Roger. I'll pop flares. We also have one individual moving. We're looking for weapons. If we see a weapon, we're going to engage.
The collateral murder video changed everything.
Now, Bushmaster, we have a van that's approaching and picking up the bodies.
The major thing that happened was that it became news all over the world.
Where's that van at? Right down there by the bodies. Okay.
There was no immediate backlash from the United States military to that. I mean, there was a reaction, but there was no backlash in the sense that there was a threat or suddenly anybody was worried that we would be arrested or so. But it was clear that we entered a whole new scene of people interested in what we do.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 18.
No one in the organisation knew the identity of the person who'd uploaded the video or where it had come from.
The way WikiLeaks is structured is basically promising the protection of the source, and the best protection is not knowing the source. And that's what we try to achieve.
The source of the video was Bradley Manning, a lonely 21-year-old private who later became Chelsea. The private was stationed in an outpost in Iraq, struggling with her identity and with the gravity of what she was seeing about US conduct in the war.
She felt affronted by what she saw. She was also in a difficult period for her. I mean, she didn't really have friends there. People weren't friendly to her. She was having all these conflicts about who she was, you know, whether she was Bradley a man or Chelsea a woman.
Manning secretly downloaded masses of classified material. Then she contacted WikiLeaks.
Well, she reached out. She had the information. She was horrified by what she had seen, which many of us have seen now. And she wanted to get it out. She called the New York Times. She called the Washington Post. Nobody would even return her call. And she found WikiLeaks. Nobody really knew about WikiLeaks in those days, but she found it online.
Assange and Manning corresponded online in encrypted conversations. At this point, neither knew the identity of the person they were speaking to.
She did find someone with a like mind in Julian. She found someone who cared about the public having information, who was worried about what happens in a war, and who believed that this information should get out. And there was no one around her who she could have that conversation with. No one.
The encrypted exchanges on the Jabber online chat service would later be collected as evidence against Manning and Assange. In one chat, as they worked on cracking a secret Defence Department password, Assange commented, "No luck so far."
You know, we had a chat room. Naturally, you can see there was lots of chat going on, and today, if I read the chat logs, if these are real chat logs, and you know, I would guess they are, then the conversations between Julian and Chelsea certainly didn't help anybody.
Assange's dealings with Manning would later be one of the factors that led to a bitter split in WikiLeaks.
This is where I think on a next level, this was an abuse of responsibility maybe, where you were milking a source. That's how I read that. And this is not something we should have been doing, or Julian should have been doing.
Over a period of months, Manning and Assange bonded through their online conversations. Manning uploaded thousands of files. Assange was keen for more. At one point, Manning said, "After this upload, that's all I really have got left." Assange replied, "Curious eyes never run dry, in my experience."
There's little to nothing about, you know, be careful. There's just a lot about, you know, what else can you provide? And even when Chelsea says there's nothing else, then there's this really fucked up comment about how the curious eye never runs dry. And that's something for me, even though I was not part of that conversation, you know, it was happening at a time where in parallel I was having a conversation with Julian just in another window of his computer, and I didn't know about what was going on. And that's in itself a terrible thing also. So it clearly shows how we were failing on an organizational level also to keep checks and balances within our own project.
I don't really care about the statement of Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who hasn't been associated with the organization since he tried to basically push Julian out of it in the midsummer of 2010.
Icelandic journalist Kristen Hrafnsson is a collaborator and admirer of Assange. He's now taken over as the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief.
Has Chelsea Manning maintained that she was misled? No. Has he maintained that she would have wanted publications to be in another format? Not to my knowledge.
No, quite the opposite, in fact.
So why would you listen to the voice of Daniel Domscheit Burke? Just listen to Chelsea Manning.
I don't think Chelsea was played at all. I think she did what she did. Julian and WikiLeaks did what they did. They connected. And I've looked at those transcripts, and I think she was looking for an outlet for this information. She found it. I didn't see anything in those transcripts where anyone was tempting her. She had the information. She released it.
Manning was arrested just 8 weeks after the video was released. She was discovered after she confessed online to another hacker that she was the WikiLeaks source.
For many years, this was the lurking monster in the room, you know, in the closet somewhere, where we were so afraid that one day one of our sources would be arrested, that we would make a mistake or so. But this was the total catastrophe.
She was detained, she was taken to Kuwait, and then they sent her to Quantico, which was even worse. It's closed now. It was a Marine facility. That's the first thing you need to know. Marines have their own thing, as it were, and I'm sure they did not like the Bradley Manning who came in, and they treated her very badly. First of all, she was in solitary for 11 months, and they made her stand at attention naked.
While Manning was detained in a military prison, WikiLeaks was still holding a huge cache of files that she'd delivered. The big media companies wanted to get their hands on whatever else Assange might have.
On the basis of collateral murder, you thought, well, if he's got access to that kind of material, then of course we would like to see more of it.
Why do you think he decided that he would cooperate with you?
I can imagine there were a number of reasons jostling around in his mind. So I think it would have occurred to him that there he was on his own. I mean, he was sort of metaphorically a fugitive. He was, when we first met him, he carried all his belongings in a couple of bags on his back. He had no fixed abode, and he was about to take on, the mightiest government on the planet. And he must have thought that was quite a frightening thing to do. So there was a kind of protective element. I imagine that he was quite conflicted in his own mind about the relative virtues of wanting to be his own publisher, his own impresario, his own showman, his own editor, against working in a team with people who would be more experienced than him in handling this kind of material. And so I think from the beginning he was quite conflicted about whether he should partner with someone like The Guardian. But in the end he decided it was worth it.
The big impact, of course, was the New York Times was also quick to get on board with WikiLeaks.
They seemed to be sort of a shoestring operation, and Assange did seem to be, a somewhat eccentric character or extreme character. He was often making pronouncements about freedom of information that were very absolutist. But I was happy to work with him.
The data set delivered by Manning contained hundreds of thousands of classified files. It was a tantalising prize for any news organisation.
There was this sort of gradual dawning that WikiLeaks had an enormous amount of material that the government didn't want out.
There had, I think, at that point, never been a leak of sensitive material on this scale.
But Julian Assange and the old mastheads were like oil and water. The partnership was difficult from the start, marred by disputes about what to publish and what should be redacted.
Over time, we were working with Der Spiegel and with Le Monde, with El País, with the New York Times. We were used to making quite nuanced and sensitive decisions about redaction, what was safe to publish and what was not. And then at the other extreme, you had Julian, who was, I don't know, less troubled by the process of redaction than we were. So I think he was quite suspicious of the way that we were working and very suspicious of any contacts with government.
Our top story this morning, the White House blasting the release of over 90,000 U.S. military records on the war in Afghanistan.
WikiLeaks dealing another massive blow to American foreign wars.
The White House has denounced the leaking of secret American military files on the war in Afghanistan by the online whistleblower WikiLeaks.
It was the largest leak of classified U.S. files in history.
I assume most of you have read some of the morning papers. So this is The Guardian from this morning, 14 pages about this topic. Also concurrently in Der Spiegel, 17 pages.
In July 2010, WikiLeaks and its collaborators went public with a massive leak. The Afghan war logs came from a trove of 90,000 incident and intelligence reports. Among other things, they revealed the covert role of Pakistan in the war and the true scale of civilian casualties.
We have tried hard to make sure that this material does not put innocents at harm. All the material is over 7 months old, so is of no current operational consequence, even though it...
WikiLeaks published documents that contained names, places and dates that the mainstream media partners had refused to include.
In the middle of releasing the Afghani papers, we had this really complicated situation with our 3 collaborating newspapers, the New York Times, Guardian and Der Spiegel, where we found out he made promises about redacting part of that publication, but no work was put into these redactions at all.
I mean, just dumping, hundreds of thousands of documents into the public space, that's not whistleblowing to me. A whistleblower who is someone who knows the information, understands it, and then can make an informed judgment that the compromise of that information and the benefit of that outweighs, the risk and the harm. Julian Assange was in no position, to make that judgment.
Did you get the sense that perhaps he didn't even care? I mean, I know there's that quote that's often used about him where he's apparently sitting with a Guardian journalist and he says he's not worried about not removing the names of Afghans because they're informants and if they get killed, well, they deserve it.
Well, I think if you are an information anarchist, which I think he is, then you think it's not my problem. He disputes that quote, but they're my colleagues, and if they say he said it, I'm satisfied he said it.
Did you say that?
No, and we are suing them for libel, and we have witnesses that show that is a libelous claim and is an ongoing dispute. So there's a lot of vitriol in the top end of the news business and a lot of backstabbing, and unfortunately we happen to be on the receiving end of it from this individual.
Good afternoon.
The stories rocked governments and intelligence establishments in capitals around the world.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
The US military claimed the leak had put lives at risk.
Mr. Assange can say whatever he likes about the greater good he thinks he and his source are doing, but the truth is they might already have on their hands the blood of some young soldier or that of an Afghan family. Disagree with the war all you want, take issue with the policy, challenge me or our ground commanders on the decisions we make to accomplish the mission we've been given. But don't put those who willingly go into harm's way, even further in harm's way, just to satisfy your need to make a point.
You saw the men who were responsible for massacres and deaths and had themselves been swimming in the pools of blood in 2 wars, dirty wars, were now claiming that the journalists who exposed those atrocities might have blood on their hands. It was surreal, and it still is.
Did you find him, in your dealings with him, did the New York Times find him, or you personally find him, that he sort of lacked a moral compass when it came to all of this stuff?
I'm a little bit hesitant to come down very hard on WikiLeaks and on Assange as as sort of the founder of WikiLeaks, because all journalists, certainly including the New York Times and myself, are doing the same sort of balancing act all the time. We write stories all the time that people would rather not have us write, and that cause people no end of grief and trouble, and sometimes, ends up with them in jail. And that's the nature of, sort of informing the public about important things. Certainly, though, Julian Assange drew the line in many instances in a different place than we would have drawn it. And sometimes, he argued, there was no line.
Increasingly, Assange himself was becoming a story his collaborators could not ignore.
At some point, we wrote a New York Times Magazine story about Assange that talked about his dirty socks, and he took great offense. I think and that did capture the tension in the relationship, because on the one hand, he was a very significant figure in the news, and a very colorful figure in the news. And if you described him in a sort of direct and honest way, the result was not always pretty.
I mean, we all have our moments of vanity, and I think Julian was not immune from vanity, but I also think he thought that actually by making himself a very high-profile figure would be, in some sense, a defense shield.
Questions of character and personal behaviour had left him exposed. Assange was despised by governments around the world. Retribution was coming. 2010 was a momentous year for Julian Assange. WikiLeaks had made him a celebrated media identity. But by the end of that year, he was under house arrest here in the UK. The US had announced an ongoing criminal investigation into the WikiLeaks releases, and Interpol had issued a red notice for his arrest in connection with sex crimes in Sweden.
Law enforcement around the world is turning up the heat on the website WikiLeaks.
An international arrest warrant can now be issued for Julian Assange.
One of these charges concerns an allegation of rape.
Interpol has put him on a wanted list in connection with rape allegations in Sweden.
2 charges of molestation and 1 of unlawful coercion.
The Swedish prosecutor did not need to issue that warrant because we were actively offering his cooperation and testimony. She got an arrest warrant for his questioning in circumstances when we were offering his testimony. It wasn't required at that time, and yet they sought it in the context of a major publication. That's why people ask questions about the timing.
The sex allegations led to even greater tension within WikiLeaks.
For me, in any kind of a serious organization, if your manager or your editor-in-chief or whoever has to face these types of accusations in order to avoid damaging the project, you take a break. This is all that we suggested. Nobody ever wanted to take away the project from Julian or so. We just wanted, let's say, this to be a little bit more professional.
The story was big news, too big for his newspaper partners to ignore.
We felt strongly that just because he was working with us, we couldn't pull our punches in the way that we covered whatever had happened in Sweden, and I think he didn't like that.
The rift in WikiLeaks became so bad that Daniel Domscheit-Berg and a number of others left.
I think September or so, 2010 is when me and the majority of the team quit the project. And when we left, let's say the next phase of WikiLeaks became all kinds of people who were entering this project that had no experience, that were there because the project was so famous, that were there because they wanted this new type of a guru or whatever, following a leader. And this is very different. I think what the biggest thing that changed is that there was nobody who was actually challenging Julian, his decisions, his position on things, his leadership.
Assange has always contested this view of events.
He was suspended. So insofar as a CEO is able to suspend employees that have problems, yes, that is the job, unfortunately. That someone has to take responsibility and suspend others. That were incidentally mentioned.
With a new team behind him, WikiLeaks released the Iraq war logs.
Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the UN High Commissioner on Torture, Human Rights First, and many others have called for full and frank investigations. It is time the United States opened up instead of covering up. The United States is in grave danger of losing its way.
Almost 400,000 secret US military field reports painted a grim picture of the coalition's military activities, including torture and summary executions. The stakes became even higher.
You are exposing the dirty secrets of the most powerful war machine in our days from a country that has decided it's above the law. It wants to create the reality it wants. And of course we assumed that it would have strong reactions and repercussions.
The most politically embarrassing leak of all was about to surface.
The online whistleblower site WikiLeaks is back at it today.
This is the third huge release of largely classified US documents by WikiLeaks this year.
First today to what the US government is calling a reckless and dangerous action.
The United States government is doing what it can to contain the damage.
As well as releasing the documents on its website, WikiLeaks has done a deal with major newspapers including The Guardian and The New York Times.
A huge cache of more than 250,000 US diplomatic cables that showed frank and often critical assessments of other governments. Ahead of the release of the cables, the New York Times followed its standard procedure and entered into negotiation with the government.
I think I started by calling the White House and telling them, by the way, we have 250,000 diplomatic cables, and they were somewhat perturbed. The Washington bureau chief and another editor and another reporter and I all went over expecting to meet with a couple of State Department officials, and instead there was this sort of rogues gallery of fairly senior officials of not just the State Department, but all the intelligence agencies and the Defense Department, and behind them, you know, maybe another 20 sort of underlings taking notes.
The first meeting was surreal. The New York Times leadership arrives with classified cables in a manila folder. We arrive with the same classified cables in a binder with a cover sheet that says classified, do not release to those not authorized to have it. And tongue-in-cheek, the first thing I said was, you are the recipient of stolen information, please give it back. Obviously, the New York Times didn't. But within that constraint, we had the ability over time to make a case as to the potential impact of reporting on information, the impact on national security, the impact on individual lives, the impact on intelligence operations, and the New York Times, on behalf of The Guardian and others in the consortium, gave us a fair hearing.
WikiLeaks saw this totally differently. This was not so much cooperation as capitulation.
They did take those stories and basically offered the powers in Washington the opportunity to convince them not to publish them. And that's taking a bit further than the the right of reply reaction.
I will never forget when Julian first told me that he had 250,000 diplomatic cables and was going to publish them. I didn't understand the significance of what he told me or how big this story would be. But he fully understood, and he said, they will chase me to the end of the earth and make my life absolute hell. But I have to do this because it is my obligation to the source. That is what WikiLeaks promises, that we will publish information in the public interest. And he said, it's my obligation to make this material available to the public, and I'll do it anyway.
Cablegate was a serious embarrassment for the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and it hardened the US government's resolve to get Assange.
Now, I'm aware that some may mistakenly applaud those responsible, so I want to set the record straight. There is nothing laudable about endangering innocent people, and there is nothing brave about sabotaging the peaceful relations between nations on which our common security depends.
We have an active, ongoing criminal investigation with regard to this matter. We are not in a position as yet to announce the result of that investigation, but the investigation is ongoing.
We have a whole process to go through, all of this information, millions of pieces of information, and assess the implications.
Assange was condemned in Australia too.
I absolutely condemn the placement of this information on the WikiLeaks website. It's a grossly irresponsible thing to do and an illegal thing to do.
Well, the Prime Minister and the Attorney General are US lackeys. It's as simple as that. They had a whole-of-government task force involving every intelligence agency and the Australian Federal Police and the Department of Defence trying to work out how to deal with WikiLeaks and me personally.
It's very nice to be free for Christmas and to smell the fresh air of Norfolk. Solitary confinement in the bottom of a Victorian prison is a significant experience.
In December 2010, Assange was briefly detained in a British jail following an extradition request from Sweden. He was held for questioning over the allegations of sex crimes. He has denied the allegations and has never been charged.
It's extremely serious, and one of the concerns that we've had since I've been in the UK is whether the extradition proceeding to Sweden, which is occurring in a very strange and unusual way, is actually an attempt to get me into a jurisdiction which will then make it easier to extradite me to the United States.
By this time, the relationship between Assange and The Guardian and the New York Times had deteriorated completely. Assange and the newspapers were now fighting for control of the story.
Of course you want to be in control. I mean, you have to be. I'm not going to cede The Guardian and our editorial judgments to someone else. But maybe he hadn't thought that through when he sat down to work with us.
Vanity came into play. Individuals who wanted this to be their big scoop, and WikiLeaks sort of being in the backdrop. The Guardian wanted this to be the Guardian story.
He's a bit megalomaniac, he's a bit narcissistic. In some sense, I think he thought proprietorially, this is my material, I got it, I brought it to you, you're ungrateful. He's very suspicious of mainstream media anyway. So the whole thing was bristling with the potential for misunderstanding and breakdown, and in the end it did break down.
In September 2011, Assange decided to go it alone. He published the entire trove of the US diplomatic cables, unredacted.
The ideology of WikiLeaks is basically offering all the documents to the public, so they can access that on every day and into the future. It's offering that as archive for history, which is very important, not to be selective. It is like the scientist who offers access to all his scientific material. Journalists don't do that. They pick and choose, and you have to trust them.
There was little trust left between Julian Assange and the media he'd been working closely with now for more than a year. Assange claimed he only decided to release the unredacted cables after a Guardian journalist published the password to the cable database.
I assume it was probably not malicious, the putting of the password in the book. It was just extremely arrogant and careless. We were never contacted to be asked whether this was at all acceptable to put the encryption password for Cablegate in a book.
Well, I think it's a complete smokescreen. And Julian, I think, decided to use that as an excuse to publish it all. But there was no sense in which he was compelled to do it. But I think a responsible thing would have been to remove it rather than say, oh, poor me, I'm now being forced to publish the whole lot. So I think it's a not very convincing excuse.
The decision to dump the unredacted cables drew fierce criticism.
Well, it was obvious to us from the documents that there was that people could be placed in a difficult, possibly dangerous situation if you just dumped it all there.
They had 10 months to do anything that they needed to do if they felt that there was any danger. And it's very important to understand that nobody has been able to prove that there has been any harm.
He doesn't know. We can tell you that people's lives were uprooted. People were jailed. There are people who were subject to these reports who are now dead. Now, were they killed because of the leak? I can't say that. Were they killed because of what they were doing that came to the attention of another government? Quite possibly, but those are facts. There was real harm, to real people as a result of what WikiLeaks did.
Inside the corridors of power in Washington, the government was desperate to find a way to shut WikiLeaks down and punish Assange.
There was this big discussion inside the government about whether Julian Assange could be prosecuted either for the publication of the materials that Chelsea Manning stole or for helping her steal it. And that was ultimately the kind of tension in the investigation. And the decision we came to was that if you could find sufficient evidence that Assange had helped steal the materials, that he had conspired to hack into government computers, or he had helped actually extract materials, that was a charge you could bring. But if you were just going to charge him with the publication of materials, that wasn't a charge that the administration was either comfortable in bringing or that it ultimately thought would hold up in U.S. courts.
Matthew Miller was helping to coordinate strategy inside the Department of Justice, which had established a secret grand jury.
A secret grand jury is a jury of American citizens that the Department of Justice uses to conduct investigations. If the government wants to indict someone, to charge them with a crime, the government can't just do it on its own volition. It has to present these charges to a grand jury, and then the grand jury makes a decision about whether to indict someone or not.
Generally speaking, they wouldn't be willing to say, yes, we have a grand jury looking at something. In this case, they were willing to confirm that on background, because there was a great deal of unhappiness across the government, at the State Department, to some degree out in the public. A lot of sort of angry calls for Julian Assange to be arrested, executed, killed in a drone strike. And, so there were some hotheads out there, and including members of Congress who were calling for that kind of thing. And so I think the Obama administration was not unhappy to let it be known that at least they were on the case, they were investigating.
In the UK, Assange could sense the net was closing. On a quiet day in June 2012, Assange made a fateful decision that would turn this London terrace into one of the most closely watched buildings in the world.
Julian sought asylum in 2012 in the Ecuadorian Embassy because he didn't have assurances that once in custody to face extradition to Sweden, he wouldn't be served with a US extradition request. We had asked the Australian government to seek those assurances. The Australian government had refused to do so. It was only then that he sought asylum, which was his right as a matter of international law.
Julian Assange was the most hunted man on earth when he came to our embassy. And it was, I think, his last resort, political asylum. He knocked our door. We knew that was right to protect him, and we took that bet.
From his refuge inside the Ecuadorian Embassy, Assange would continue to release America's secrets. Next week on Four Corners. In the 2016 campaign, WikiLeaks sent shockwaves through the US political system. The publication of thousands of emails stolen from senior figures in the Democratic National Committee was enthusiastically embraced by candidate Donald Trump. Now, as president, Trump has flipped. His administration is coming after Assange. But is it just about national security, or is it also part of a broader attack on media freedom?